the bulldozer rolled onto my lawn before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. Its engine growled like a warning, treads spitting mud, and a woman with a tablet smiled as if she already owned the day. They told me my workshop was unsafe. They called it an eyesore, a liability, a nuisance. They sent letters, inspectors, fines, all signed by the same name that kept appearing on the paperwork, Catherine Mills. But the truth was uglier. This wasn't about safety. It was a plan. Demolition, redevelopment, and profit. And my grandfather's sign hung right where their new lots would be. My name is Frank Grant. I fix things for a living. I wire circuits, trace faults, and I know how crooked systems are built. They thought they were pulling a quick demolition. They didn't know I'd been wiring this place for decades. This isn't just a fight over wood and nails. It's about a man who refused to be erased, and the moment he decided to short-circuit a whole scam. This is my story. If you've ever believed that principle should matter more than power, tap like and subscribe now, because in the next few minutes, you'll see how one quiet engineer, a man everyone dismissed, stood his ground against an entire system built to silence him, and how that stand would expose a truth big enough to shake an entire neighborhood. The sound hit first, deep, grinding, metallic. Not the low hum of my own machines, but the growl of something heavier. By the time my coffee brewed, the rumble had settled into my bones. I stepped out onto the porch, mug in hand, and froze. A bulldozer sat at the edge of my driveway, treads caked in mud, engine coughing gray smoke into the morning air. Two men in orange vests were huddled over blueprints on the hood of a white pickup that had Willow Heights HOA maintenance stenciled on the side. And there she was, Catherine Mills, HOA president, tablet in one hand, and that smug little smile that said she already owned the day. She waved when she saw me. "Morning, Mr. Grant. We're here to start the demolition order." "Demolition of what?" I asked, voice still rough from sleep. "Your structure," she said, gesturing towards the large corrugated workshop my father built 50 years ago. "It's been deemed unsafe, non-compliant, and an eyesore for the community." We sent multiple notices. I looked past her to the old workshop, the heart of my property. Faded red siding, patched roof, hand-painted Grant and Son Repairs sign still hanging above the bay door. Inside sat my father's old lathe, my mother's tool cabinet, and the same workbench I'd built my first motorcycle on at 16. Unsafe? That shop had survived 3 hurricanes, a tornado, and 40 years of Texas summers. And now a committee of suburban tyrants wanted to flatten it for aesthetic uniformity. What they didn't know was that I wasn't some retiree clinging to the past. I was Frank Grant, 63, a retired electrical engineer. And that old workshop was wired tighter and stronger than anything these paper pushers could imagine. When the HOA first formed, I hadn't paid them much attention. Most of my neighbors were new homeowners, people from the city chasing rural charm, without knowing what rural meant. They liked country air as long as everything was beige and nobody actually worked on anything. The first warning letter came in April. Unregistered commercial structure on residential property. Immediate inspection required. I laughed, crumpled it, and tossed it in the trash. My workshop had stood since the 1970s, long before Willow Heights existed. By May, the tone shifted. Photos, citations, fines, $100 for unauthorized signage, $200 for visible oil containers, $500 for structural non-compliance. Every notice signed by Catherine Mills, attorney, HOA president, and, as I'd later find out, co-founder of Mills Development Group, a construction firm that specialized in community modernization's translation, demolish, rebuild, profit. When I refused to pay, they switched tactics. The letters stopped, but the harassment started. Inspectors appeared unannounced, snapping photos through my fence. One even climbed it to peek through the window. That's when I started documenting them. I pulled out some old security cameras, wired them to a custom DVR I'd built from scrap. Every visit, every vehicle, every license plate, recorded. If they wanted a war, I'd fight it like an engineer, with data, patience, and planning. So when the bulldozer showed up, I already knew Catherine's playbook. The unsafe claim came from a falsified inspection signed by her cousin Brian Mills, conveniently employed at the city's building safety department. They figured I wouldn't notice the surname. I stepped off the porch, hands in my pockets. "You're trespassing," I said. "That's private property." "Mr. Grant, you've had plenty of warnings," she replied, motioning to the operator. "Please step back for your safety." "Before you start tearing down my family's livelihood," I said, raising my phone, "you might want to know that your demolition order violates Texas Property Code 202.003, existing use exemptions for pre-HOA structures." That made her blink. "Excuse me?" "This workshop was built in 1974. Your HOA was formed in 2012. Your authority doesn't apply retroactively." The men by the truck hesitated. One lowered his clipboard. "Also," I added, "this whole scene is being recorded. By me and by 4 cameras around the property." Catherine's smile faltered. "You're bluffing." I raised my mug and pointed to the roofline, where a small red light blinked in the haze. Her composure cracked. "This isn't over, Mr. Grant." "It never is," I said. Engines wound down. The bulldozer reversed, men muttering relief. Catherine climbed into her SUV, window half open. "You're delaying the inevitable. That workshop's coming down, one way or another." I smiled. "Then I guess it's time I rewired the inevitable." As the vehicles rumbled away, I looked back at the garage, paint chipped, air still sharp with diesel. They wanted a fight. They just didn't realize I'd already started building the trap. 3 days after the bulldozer incident, Willow Heights felt different. Neighbors who once waved now turned away. Word spread fast. The old mechanic on the corner had defied the HOA. Around here, reputation travels quicker than rumor. I wasn't surprised. Catherine Mills ran this subdivision like a private empire. She chaired every committee, approved every violation, and smiled while she did it. The envelope that landed in my mailbox Tuesday morning proved she wasn't done with me. Notice of continued non-compliance. The fines had doubled. The last line threatened a lien if unpaid within 30 days. That wasn't enforcement. It was extortion by paperwork. I poured coffee, cleared my father's drafting table, and spread every HOA letter across the surface. The wood still bore knife scratches from when he cut gasket paper there. Years in engineering taught me that when systems fail, you trace the wires backward. Somewhere in that mess of legal language was the power source feeding this whole circuit. By noon, I'd found my first short circuit. The independent inspection condemning my workshop came from the city's building safety department. Inspector name, Brian Mills, Catherine's cousin. His signature appeared on 3 other demolitions that later became projects for Mills Development Group, her husband's company. Destroy, rebuild, profit. My place was next. I spent hours combing county records. Same pattern every time. Homes sited, torn down, and replaced under HOA improvement contracts handled by the same firm. It was a loop designed to print money. I printed copies, stacked them beside my father's wrenches, and for the first time in months felt that old current of purpose hum through me. They'd picked the wrong man to bully. That night I mounted 2 extra cameras on the fence and a motion sensor by the gate. If they came again, I'd have every plate and timestamp logged. Around 10, my phone buzzed. It was Jerry. one of the quieter HOA board members, the only one who'd ever spoken to me like a person. "Frank," he whispered, "Catherine pushed an emergency vote tonight. She's filing for forced demolition next week." "On what grounds?" "She's claiming oil leaks from your shop are polluting the drainage." I laughed. "That ditch hasn't carried water since '09. "Doesn't matter." "She's got the board spooked." "Thanks for the heads up, Jerry." When the call ended, I sat in the dark, the shop lights humming behind me. That building wasn't just a shed. It was a memory. Every tool a piece of my father's hands. Losing it would mean losing him all over again. The next morning I drove downtown to the courthouse. If Catherine wanted a fight on paper, she'd get one. The clerk on duty, Mrs. Reynolds, squinted at my forms. "Grant? Your daddy fixed my husband's truck back in the '80s. "That's him," I said. She smiled. "Still keeping the lights on out there?" "Trying to." She leaned closer. "If you're looking into that HOA, check zoning archives. Lot of funny filings in there." 6 hours later, in a dusty basement that smelled like mildew and bureaucracy, I found it. A development proposal labeled Willow Heights Expansion Phase 2. Filed by Mills Development Group 6 months before the HOA even existed. The blueprint showed new lots and a commercial strip running straight across my land, right where my workshop stood. So that was the plan. Safety and aesthetics were just camouflage. What they wanted was my property. I copied every page, scanned the signatures, and saved them to a flash drive. When I got home, dusk was settling over the pecan trees, and the air carried that mix of motor oil and cedar I'd known my whole life. The old sign above the bay door read, "Grant and Son Repairs." The paint was faded, but the letters still stood proud. They thought they could bury that sign under contracts and concrete. They had no idea they'd just handed me every wire I needed to short-circuit their scheme. I poured a fresh cup of coffee and cleared the table again. Permits, names, dates, signatures, each became a connection in my head. The system they built was about to feed back on itself, and when it did, it wouldn't just burn a circuit, it would burn reputations. Because if Catherine Mills wanted demolition, she was about to learn what happens when you try to knock down the wrong man's foundation. The next morning started quiet. Too quiet for Willow Heights. No engine noise, no HOA trucks creeping past the driveway, not even the morning joggers who usually waved out of obligation. The silence told me something was brewing. People in this neighborhood didn't disappear. They ducked for cover when Catherine Mills started tightening her grip. I spent the morning turning my workshop into a war room. The workbench became a command center. Documents spread across the surface like blueprints for a counterattack. Permits, inspection reports, HOA bylaws, and every photo I'd taken. My father used to say, "Measure twice, cut once." I planned to measure every lie Catherine ever wrote, and cut her whole scheme off at the power line. The first move was legal. I called Jim Patterson, an old friend from my contracting days, now a lawyer with a chip on his shoulder for corporate bullies. "Jim, I need your help dismantling an HOA scam," I said. He chuckled. "You finally ticked off a board, huh?" "More like I tripped their money wire. They've been running demolition contracts through family companies. I've got paperwork." "Bring everything to my office," he said. "And Frank, don't tell anyone you're fighting back yet." Let them think you're still cornered. That suited me fine. Engineers thrive on quiet planning. That afternoon, I met him downtown. His office smelled like old books and burnt coffee. I laid the blueprints and permits across his desk, explaining how each demolition tied back to Mills Development Group. Jim's eyes narrowed with each page. "Conflict of interest, property fraud, misuse of HOA funds," he muttered. "If half of this holds up, she's looking at criminal exposure." That's what I was hoping to hear. He tapped the papers. You're gonna need solid documentation for every connection. Follow the money. Follow the signatures. I already have. They've been routing HOA improvement fees into her husband's account. Jim leaned back, grinning. Well, Frank, looks like you're sitting on a live circuit. You want me to flip the breaker, or do you? I'll set it up. You pull the switch when it's time. When I got home, I walked straight to my father's old toolbox. Inside, wrapped in an oil rag, was his brass nameplate, Thomas Grant, Master Mechanic. I set it on the bench. All right, Dad, I said quietly. Time to fix another broken system. That night, the trap started taking shape. I drafted emails posing as a cooperative homeowner, requesting copies of the HOA's annual financial reports. They were obligated by law to provide them, but Catherine never expected anyone to actually read them. The moment she replied, I'd have her digital fingerprints on the records. By midnight, my cameras caught headlights slowing near the fence. A dark SUV. I muted the lights inside and watched from the window. Two silhouettes. Flashlights cutting across my property sign, lingering on the garage door before driving off. Probably inspectors. I smiled to myself. Every second of it was recorded. The next morning, a new email from Catherine pinged into my inbox. Mr. Grant, your request for financial reports will require board review. Please allow 2 weeks for processing. 2 weeks? That told me everything. She was scrambling. I forwarded it to Jim. He called within the hour. She's stalling. We'll subpoena the records instead. That'll light a fire. In the meantime, I went after her public mask. Catherine had built her reputation on being the face of community improvement. Every HOA meeting was a stage where she lectured about safety, modernization, and property harmony. I decided it was time the audience saw the wires behind her curtain. I contacted Elizabeth Warner, a retired journalist who'd written for the county paper. Her son had played Little League with mine years back. I sent her a short message. You like stories about corruption? I've got one wired from the inside. She met me at a diner 2 towns over. I slid the flash drive across the table. Financial misappropriation, falsified inspections, conflict of interest, I said. All documented. Elizabeth flipped through the files on her tablet, her eyes widening. This is a career-ending kind of mess. Good, I said, because she's been trying to erase my family's history for profit. We agreed to hold the story until the right moment. Timing mattered. You don't blow the fuse until the current's built up enough to make an impact. Over the next week, I kept a low profile, let them think the old mechanic had backed off. But behind the scenes, the plan was wiring itself together. Legal filings with Jim, media backup with Elizabeth, and my camera footage stored in 3 separate encrypted drives. On Friday evening, I sat in the workshop with the radio humming soft blues. The smell of oil and dust felt like home. I pulled out the latest HOA notice. Final warning, immediate demolition authorization pending. I smiled. Perfect timing. Because what Catherine Mills didn't know was that while she was preparing her big show, I'd already wired her spotlight to blow. The HOA called an emergency meeting Tuesday night. The email headline read, Community Safety and Property Compliance. I could almost hear Catherine Mills smiling as she sent it. Perfect. It was the stage I'd been waiting for. I arrived early at the Willow Heights Community Center, grease-stained jacket on, leather folder under my arm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, giving the place the charm of an interrogation room. Folding chairs faced a table draped with a blue cloth. Behind it sat Catherine, flanked by her loyal board. Smiles tight, eyes sharper than nails. Neighbors filled the room, whispering. Phones out. Word had spread. Tonight they'd decide whether to demolish my workshop. Catherine tapped the mic. Let's begin. Tonight's issue: an ongoing safety hazard at 42 Willow Bend. She clicked a remote, and a projector lit up with close-ups of my shop. Rust streaks, a cracked board, an angle that made the roof sag. She narrated like a prosecutor. Electrical risks, oil leaks, structural decay. Mr. Grant's refusal to comply endangers everyone here. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. I let it build. The higher she climbed, the further she'd fall. When she finally paused, I stood. Mind if I respond? She smiled, too sweet. Briefly, please. Sure. I walked forward, folder in hand. Thanks for showing those pictures. They remind me what real craftsmanship looks like. That shop stood for 50 years without a single injury. Mr. Grant, this isn't about nostalgia, she snapped. Right, it's about safety. Let's talk about how you proved it was unsafe. I pulled a small USB from my pocket. Because your inspection report came from this man. The screen changed to video. Time-stamped footage of her cousin Brian Mills climbing my fence with a clipboard. No warrant, no notice. Gasps filled the room. That's your inspector, I said. He never entered legally, never tested a beam, and filed his report before he even left my driveway. Catherine's voice shook. This footage is an invasion of privacy. Funny, considering your team invaded mine. I switched slides. Financial spreadsheets filled the wall. HOA improvement payments flowing into Mills Development Group, her husband's company. Every time you find a homeowner, those funds ended up here. And according to county records, I held up a blueprint. You filed a development plan 6 months before this HOA existed. Those new lots? They cut straight through my property. This wasn't about safety. It was a land grab. Voices exploded across the room. Some neighbors cursed. Others stared at her in disbelief. Catherine slammed the table. You can't make baseless accusations. Baseless? I nodded toward the door. Jim Patterson, my attorney, stepped in carrying a briefcase. Jim just filed complaints with the state attorney general. Fraud, conflict of interest, and racketeering. Everything you've seen tonight is in the report. Her board members froze. One dropped his pen. Another pushed his chair back slowly, eyes wide. I faced the room. I'm not here to humiliate anyone. But every one of you has been paying fees into a system that was bleeding you dry. You deserve to know where your money went. From the back, Elizabeth Warner, the journalist, raised her camera. The flash popped once. Tomorrow the whole county would know. Catherine's control cracked. This meeting is adjourned. No, said Jerry, the quiet board member, standing. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence. I second that, came a voice from the crowd. Hands shot up across the room, nearly everyone. Catherine turned pale. You can't. We just did, Jerry said flatly. Silence followed, thick and final. The projector hummed, still showing the financial graph that looked like a confession in bar chart form. Jim leaned close and whispered, You just rewired an entire HOA. I smiled. Guess I still know how to fix a system when it starts sparking. I packed my folder and stepped outside. The night air felt lighter than it had in months. Down the road, moonlight glinted off the tin roof of my workshop. The same roof my father had hammered by hand, still standing proud. They'd tried to erase history with legal jargon and greed. Instead, they'd made it indestructible. By sunrise the next morning, Willow Heights was buzzing louder than my old drill press. The story had gone public. Elizabeth Warner's article hit the county paper like a lightning strike. HOA President under investigation for fraud and conflict of interest. Residents demand accountability. Her piece laid everything out. Video footage, financial transfers, even a quote from Jerry confirming the board's unanimous vote to remove Catherine Mills. By noon, TV trucks were parked at the entrance to the subdivision. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me were suddenly waving from their driveways, some mouthing, "Thank you." I didn't gloat. It wasn't victory that filled me. It was relief. After months of manipulation and threats, the truth finally had voltage. By that weekend, the county had launched a full audit of the HOA. Investigators froze the board's accounts, subpoenaed records, and discovered what I'd suspected. Years of community improvement fees rerouted to Mills Development Group. The firm's contracts were canceled, and a grand jury was convened within 2 months. Catherine resigned from both the HOA and her law practice. Her husband vanished from public sight. Rumor had it they'd sold their house and left town before the indictments hit. I didn't chase confirmation. Some things are better left to the echo of justice. The board held a reorganization meeting a month later. Jerry stopped by my place beforehand, hat in hand. "Frank," he said, "we want you to sit on the new compliance committee." "You know more about fairness than any of us." I smiled. "Appreciate it, Jerry, but I'm done wiring committees." "I've got engines to rebuild." He grinned. "Can't say I blame you." When he left, I stepped outside to the porch. The late afternoon sun hit the workshop just right, the red siding glowing like it had been freshly painted. But the truth was, I hadn't changed a thing. That old wood, scarred and worn, was honest, something the world didn't see much of anymore. The State Historical Office had already reached out. Elizabeth forwarded my case to a preservation group, and after a few site visits, they granted the building heritage status under the Texas Historical Structures Act. That meant the workshop was now legally protected. No future HOA, developer, or bureaucrat could ever lay a finger on it. When the plaque arrived in the mail, I mounted it beside the door with the same screws my father once used to hang his sign. Grant and Son Repairs, since 1974. For a moment, I could almost hear him whistling behind me, smell the machine oil and cedar shavings that used to cling to his jacket. That evening, as the cicadas started up and the light faded to amber, I brewed coffee and sat on the old stool by the workbench. The place was quiet, except for the hum of the fluorescent bulb and the tick of the cooling engine I'd been working on. The calm felt earned. It wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that some things still mean something. A man's work, a family's legacy. The idea that fairness can outlast greed if you've got the patience to trace the wires and fix what's broken. Later that week, a young neighbor named Paul stopped by. He was maybe 30, a mechanic in training. "Mr. Grant," he said, "heard what you did at that meeting. Everyone's talking about it. I just wanted to say, you gave folks around here a little hope." "Hope's like current," I told him. "It only flows if the line's grounded right. You stand your ground, the current finds its way." He smiled, nodded, and looked around the shop. "You ever think about teaching?" I chuckled. "I already am, kid. Every bolt in here's a lesson." After he left, I looked up at the rafters where my father had once carved his initials. TG, the dust around them glowed in the beam of light sneaking through the window. I realized something then. Catherine had tried to demolish a building, but what she really struck was a family line of builders. We didn't destroy, we repaired. When I closed up for the night, I flipped off the switch I'd rewired years ago, a small modification that powered the lights with just the right delay. As the bulbs dimmed one by one, I could still see the sign outside through the window. Grant and Son Repairs. It stood there quietly, defiant and permanent, under a sky of fading gold. You could call it revenge if you wanted. I just call it restoration, the kind that doesn't need blueprints, just grit and a little wiring know-how, because sometimes, to fix a broken system, you don't need to fight it head-on. You just trace the current back to its source, cut the bad wire, and let the truth light the place back up again. If stories like this remind you that integrity still matters, that truth can outlast power, tap like and subscribe, so you don't miss the next story that proves quiet courage can still make the loudest noise.